And part of what I'm trying to lay out in Raising Expectations, and part of what I was trying to do in the room tonight, is suggest it takes a lot of skill and a lot of discipline. And it's a skill and discipline that almost every single person in this room and almost every worker I know and we all know is capable of doing, by the way. But I'm not of the school that simply says that people wake up knowing how to win wars. Soldiers get trained, if we're going to a military analogy. This stuff takes real work. So, you know, in our model, we equally trained, and this is a really important part of the sort of the radicalization of the model. We equally trained. When I said that once we identified the organic leader and then we trained them to our skill set, like, we trained workers at every level to the same exact way that we trained our staff professional organizers. There was no distinction in the level of conversation and the level of training. All the worker leaders in our shop's going to do something called charting, which was essentially understanding the power structure among and between the workers and the work site, but making wall charts and giant wall charts with yellow highlights for the organic leaders and pink for activists. And, you know, so I really think the work is urgent and it's necessary, but we do ourselves a disservice when we're not clear about the fact that there's a serious skill set to the craft of organizing. And a lot of what I did in the book Raising Expectations was my level damnedest to simplify it, popularize it, and tell a bunch of stories, but that underscored that there's an approach, there's a discipline, there's a method, there are methods, and they kind of matter. And everything from, you know, how do you hold a good meeting, to how do you recruit someone, to how do you, you know, people go to one bad meeting, man, they're never coming back, period. And you know how many bad meetings there are run by leftists? Yeah. Raise your hand if you've been to a bad meeting run by the left. All right, I rest my case. So, you know, running a good meeting takes a lot of skill. And thinking ahead of time about the agenda and having fun things to do and having people make real decisions and how do you actually, you know, it's like, it really matters. Every part of what we do. In our training model, we say every single conversation with the worker requires a strategy. You know, we're like hiring people and they're like, how are you talking about every conversation requires a strategy? We're like, yeah, every single conversation requires a strategy. If we want to build the kind of army that can take on Capitol or Wall Street or all the rhetoric bullshit that we do all the time. Let's take on Wall Street. Really? You can't organize a school. Good luck taking on Wall Street, brothers. Like, you got to get your shit together. It's skill and discipline and vision and method, right? So it's a lot of things. So, but on the urgency of doing it, definitely. And then sort of moving through some of the earlier questions. So there were two things that still related in the first and second comments and questions about the collective bargaining model. And I appreciate the comment about the urgency of sort of being honest and transparent about showing what the union did or didn't win. And I don't want to sound silly when I say this, but I definitely try not to have a big list of things that we didn't win. Really, it's like a principle, like we like to win. So we try and build an army that can actually get us to a much longer list of things we won in the bargaining process than not. But clearly there are times we lose, by the way, and I had the pleasure of bargaining in the service sector that was growing, not in a auto sector where concession bargaining was the rule, or at least that was the attempt, right, in a diminishing sector in the new economy. So I'm clear that I was bargaining in the new economy with employers that had money to settle, but I also want to argue that that was part of our strategy. We were picking employers who had money so that we could have a fight and win it, right? There was a lot that went into the strategy of the targeting of the markets, the sectors, the employers, etc. So, but I still think in a couple of the first questions, the one about voting the bums out of office and the incumbency and, you know, their rap about, you know, why would you throw out the person who's bargained a great contract, or putting up the list, or the urgency of trying to put up an honest list of what we won or didn't win. I mean, to me, it goes back to the model that we developed of very transparent negotiations. It didn't set us up for either of those, because if everyone was in the room, and really our goal was to cycle every single worker through bargaining. I just want to be clear about how we did it. It didn't mean every worker came to bargaining on the same day. We actually had a method, and our goal was to get every single worker in every facility at bargaining at least once during the life of that contract fight. So we had rotations, people traded bargaining books, they handed bargaining books to each other. Workers themselves were writing the contract language with me often. We created what were called article committees. That was part of the discipline bargaining process. The article committees had an article chair, and that was one worker who was responsible for all the language in that article as it went across the table multiple times. And I would argue that we needed to have article committees, because, you know, when you get to a certain point in a large, complicated bargaining fight with thousands of workers in a big facility, for sake of argument, it's so much to keep track of, especially as the compression starts happening, meaning when you're winning. And there's a lot going back and forth across the table, a lot. And my whole philosophy was, you want to win this stuff? This is your contract fight. And you're going to bargain the contract. And you're going to sit in here and write the articles. And I'm going to teach you strong language versus weak language. And not just the technical thing of strong versus weak language. We can all do that, but you're responsible for this language. I don't want to hear that I screwed up if the wrong language goes across the table at the moment of settlement. It's like literally your contract. I'm your coach. And I'm going to handle the boss in a tough SOB moment when the boss is like, it's another important thing about the collective bargaining model we had. Workers who talked a lot in bargaining, all very planned, did not want to talk at the table, thousands of them, one by one, and planned, if the boss could go back at them. So I should mention that an evolution of this, just along with the article committees as well, that whole worker teams had responsibility for the dues article, for the overtime article, for the shift diff article, for whatever it was, the labor management committee, the article. So the article committees were responsible for the articles, and they would meet in caucus time and prep and bring language and all this stuff. But we also had a rule with the boss, which made it much more comfortable for workers to talk, which was workers, when they talked, if the boss wanted to ask a question back, because the boss understood early on that could intimidate the hell out of them, the boss could only talk to me, or the chief negotiator. So workers would speak, it was a one-way thing. And we said it up front, here's the rules, by the way, bargaining. Our workers are talking at you, and if you have a question, you're not going to ask the worker, you're going to ask me. And then it completely loosened up the workers from feeling sort of safe, like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, what if I say the wrong thing? You know, what if they're tricking me, they're trying to trick me? Because they are, right? They're definitely trying to trick you in the middle of the bargaining process. So that was just a tactic, but I still think that when we set up this very large transparent model where every single worker cycles through at least once and begins to have a very, very different appreciation for what this thing called collective bargaining is, it becomes very powerful. And then the way that we show the limits of collective bargaining was by bringing the community fights and doing planning time during caucus time. Because definitely the salvation for workers was not just winning a contract. In our case, it was leading a housing fight, leading a fight against the reduction in transit time or cuts or bus lines, but all those things we did as part of a worksite bargaining fight. We would bring all the planning time right into the collective bargaining time to get the message across that our work didn't stop at the contract, our work didn't stop in the workplace, our work continued straight into the community where we're going to have bigger fights with folks in a working class movement. So the question of how we do the community work and how we organize often work-site-less or less work-site-based workers there's a good connection there. So several things. When I say, again, I want to go back to just a core concept when you have a work site, which is workplace charting. Right, a workplace charting is, you know, a hand chart or a wall chart. It's got every worker's name and the shift and the something. We're charting power relationships and the social networks among and between workers, right? That's fundamentally what we're doing. What we developed was a model to do the exact same thing outside of the workplace, just as systematically, by the way. So we began to chart the social networks and the social relationships of the workers when they leave the workplace, if they're in a workplace, and if they don't have a workplace, definitely for home care workers, child care workers, and a whole bunch more, we want to do the same thing, though. We want to chart the social relationships that every worker has. Now, it may be true, I don't know if it's true, it may be true in the States that there's more of a texture to some of this stuff. I'm not sure. It's a question for you. Lots of our workers, certainly the lower wage workers, there's a relationship between the more precarious workers and high participation in religion, in mutual aid societies of immigrant workers, in community clubs, in soccer clubs and Little League, and all sorts of different associations that workers have. Again, for us, it tends to be that the more poor the worker, the more precarious the worker, the higher their the higher level of social networks they actually have in the broader community. It's an interesting inverse relationship from some of the, let's say, more professional kind of workers who don't apparently socialize very much when they leave work. That's what we found. So they have different skill sets and different abilities. But we actually began a model, and there is a slide that shows it somewhere in here, the early slides, that's in 3 languages, in Haitian Creole and Spanish and in English, where we created what appears on paper like a survey, but it's really just a training for how you engage in a conversation that both raises expectations with workers outside of work and begins to understand what their social and familial networks are in the community. And then we begin to organize them through those networks. So in the States, that's often through religious structures. If we find out that we've got 4 workers who go to one church, we're going to meet with those 4 workers, who maybe, by the way, don't even know that they're members of the union or about to become members of the union, and they've been sitting in the pews, one at Wednesday Hour of Power, and one at the first session on Sunday, and one at the second session on Sunday, if it's that kind of a church versus an imam or a Jew or whatever it is, right? And these things matter, all of it. But so to generalize, though, we begin to organize people in the community through their social structures. For a lot of our Latino workers, really, if they were guys, it meant the soccer clubs on the soccer fields on the weekends. So who plays soccer together? And we began to build soccer network teams. People would actually have meetings, and then we would build soccer t-shirts for them. And then but it's all really nuanced and real. So definitely with precarious workers, for us, and then also getting to tests and assessments to do organic leader ID. The same theory can work if they're sitting inside of community structures outside of the workplace. You can begin to test and assess their leadership abilities. If they're the choir leader in a big church on Sunday, they're probably actually, by the way, a leader. They're going to bring along a minister, and they're going to bring along a whole bunch of people who are in their choir at church that day. So we're going to help them form a workplace consciousness, even if they don't have a workplace. We're going to try and create structures where structures don't exist, because part of what I'm actually writing about now is part of the brilliance of Marx, talking about workers in the workplace. I'm trying to generalize into a broader theory of building structure where structure doesn't exist for workers, so that they can bond, and that we can understand how they bond through their social networks, housing complexes, religious institutions, soccer clubs, all of it. That we need to see them as structures, any place that workers come in contact and relate. And we have to carry our model into that system. So that's one way, and it relates to how we do the community work. So again, we chart very systematically, and then we begin to bring workers together by neighborhood, by church, by temple, by rabbi, whatever the form of their religion is, by religious orientation, by religious group. And then we have them meet by substructure, like church, temple, etc. And then we have them go approach their minister. Can they talk about the reason why the union matters to them inside their place of faith? Can they have a few minutes during the soccer match before it begins or after it begins to talk about what's happening at the union hall at the soccer club? So that's one way that we actually create solidarities. The other is that it's just as important to figure out what issues matter. Like, we don't want, in the States, there's this dynamic called social movement unionism. On a good day, it's what most of our unions are doing, on a good day, if they're doing it at all. If they're thinking beyond the workplace, it's like some group from the community comes to a Central Labor Council meeting and says, we're having an anti-poor persons march or an anti-immigrant deportation march. Can you vote us $1,000 to get a bus to some rally? Like, that's what happens on most days, if we do it at all. And it's this very sort of weird third-party thing. We, in the same conversation where we actually have these charts and we're charting all the social networks of the workers and their family and their mother and their sister and their aunt and their uncle and their brother, all the things that Grover Norquist talked about in the Chattanooga campaign. We were doing this first. We want to understand their whole family, the whole family relationship, who's in a union, who's not, what worksite their family members are in, every single family member in these conversations that take a good hour to do. We can get them in 30 minutes, we really try, but they take about an hour. Huge investment on the front end. And we asked them in those conversations, if you were mayor tomorrow, mayor is the first question. Because when you've related to workers as workers in a union for a while and they don't think of the union as something outside of the workplace, you have to actually shift their mentality. You have to get them to start to see the union as a community force. And to do that is through a series of questions, like, if you were elected mayor tomorrow, what are the first 3 things that you would want to do? Because if you nationalize the banks, excellent. But really, like, it actually takes a while to help the mentality shift. So we're doing 2 things in the conversation when we're prompting people that if you were elected mayor tomorrow, what are the first 3 things you would do? One, we're doing the same thing we were doing when we first met them in the worksite only fight, which was hearing the 3 issues that matter most to them. And if they say, I'd fix the bus system, because I used to have to take 1 bus to work and now I have to take 4. And it used to take me 35 minutes to get to work, and now it takes me 2 hours each way. Because I have 2 transfers, and it's freezing cold outside, by the way, right? Okay, I'm hearing, when I start to hear a pattern as an organizer that a whole bunch of workers are having a transit problem, we're starting to develop a logic of what the issue is we want to work on. So the community issue that we're going to work on as the union must, in our model, come from the workers themselves. We're not going to go make it up as the staff, or some coalition comes to us to chat about something with us. No. We need to know what the workers themselves are concerned about when they punch the clock and leave work. That allows us to come up with 1 or 2 issues a year, because we were a union first, right? So our primary workers in the workplace. But very deep and intense levels of work would go on in the community, and we'd let the workers themselves select the issue. And then we'd map their social networks. And then that whole structure created a mechanism and creates a mechanism where leadership keeps getting developed all year long. So we're not just going from contract fight to contract fight and putting workers to sleep in between and then coming and waking them up again 3 years later. Hey, wake up, time to fight the contract. Not a great model. It's not working for any of us, I don't think. So having ways to constantly develop skill and ability and anchoring it in the same exact model, i.e., what are the issues that you want to work on, what matters to you, and anchoring it in the actual desires and demands of the workers matters. And gives us a way to keep high engagement in between the contract fight. And that was a really important concept in SEIU itself, like the idea that we needed to do things all the time between the contract. The other was the direct action model of the workplace. Now I have to tell you, in our union in the States, that was not in favor. Like, people didn't want us doing direct action in the workplace. A lot of us did it anyway, because it continues to develop the skill and ability of the workers in the workplace if they're doing direct action to do conflict resolution and not just filing a grievance with some reified steward who becomes the best friend of management and loses touch with the workers. So it's both those things. And then going back to it's a little bit related to the question also from the airlines, right, in terms of apathy. I mean, our goal was to not let apathy develop. Can we win every fight? Hell no. But we also need to be somewhat strategic about the fights that we're picking, which doesn't mean we only pick winnable fights. It's sort of old Alinskyism. We're not going to just pick things that we think are winnable or easy. But we have to have some, for example, when we were picking employers in Nevada, just like when you're picking a fight, hot shop organizing is something that became fashionable because workers with really bad conditions working for a really horrible employer may be the only ones actually still calling a union. On the other hand, it's super hard to win there because they got nothing to give you because they're actually poorly run crap with no profit margins and they're just barely surviving. Well, we're not going to be able to show a really good model of organizing if we only organize crappy employers. So, in Nevada the model was we're going to go for the biggest cash cows in the entire for-profit national hospital system and prove that we could win and win big there because they actually had money to spend if we could mobilize enough power to get them to the table. So it's a little bit of that, and then it's a little bit of everything I just said in terms of we need to be letting workers, enabling workers, coaching workers into a lot of campaigns. Some start small, some move to bigger ones that always have to be in the workplace, and they might even be something like getting a shift supervisor fired, which may take a lot less energy, but suddenly give workers a lot of confidence that they can move on from getting a shift worker fired to doing something much bigger in the workplace. So it's a gradation of taking people through a mix of let's work on something slightly easier today, let's work on something much harder tomorrow. I mentioned that comment, I just want to say it one more time, which is that in my experience, definitely, unfortunately, sometimes for the revolution, workers don't come to work to fight every day. They don't. Definitely not in a hospital. They really do want it to be quiet and to get work done and to be peaceful and to take care of their patients. And so it's a calibration for us. That's why engaging people in fights outside the workplace also becomes really important, because we got to have some peaceful moments in the workplace, and we got to keep people active. So our solution to that was to be as systematic and methodical on the non-workplace issues, so that there's a constant flow. Leaders don't have to be the leader every day. They can be the leader this month, and then next month we have someone else who's going to step up. And they understand the responsibility between each other, that sometimes they just need to take a break because they're having a divorce. Or our contract fight got them into a divorce, or whatever, which happens too, in the gender politics of the American labor movement often. There are times when people are having a crisis and they need to be able to eddy out. And they can only eddy out if there's a whole bunch of people ready to step in and not be eddied out. And that's part of the methodology.
I was just going to say that you get to ask a question as a reward for organizing this.
Great. Okay. That's good because I have a question. Okay, and then I saw a couple hands up too. So my question is, Jane, my sense of the stories you told about well, particularly Nevada, is that when you went to Nevada, you were in a leadership role, in that you were, you know, you were, I can't remember your title, I don't know if were you a director?
Executive director.
Executive director, okay, so you were in a leadership role, in a sense, charged with some support, though I know far less at the end, but by the National Union to develop and run a program. What starting advice do you have for those of us in the room who might be staff for a union, an elected officer on a local union executive board, or a rank and file activist that don't have that kind of backing for a structural programmatic change, but who want to take the kind of tools and ideas that you have thrown out throughout the night tonight and start making change? And my question, let me boil it down a little bit more. Do you think it requires a starting point of a conversation about how, look, we're being slammed, are we going to try to do things differently and a certain amount of buy-in to the desire to change, or do you just start trying to make change in different ways, and what are those key starting points?
So that's the question of sort of complicated policy or zoning or whatever it is, or transit stuff. I mean, that it kind of relates right back to some of the discussion about bargaining, too, in the worksite, which can be very complicated. Right? It's super complicated. In fact, that's the excuse all the time to not let workers involved in it, because it's so complicated. Labor law is so complicated until it's not, because you actually make it not complicated. So, and having done transit work on union campaigns for better transit, which is a big one in Seattle and Tacoma, because literally we had our rank and file members who couldn't get to the nursing homes anymore because they were now having to take 4 transfers instead of 1 bus and the whole thing. It goes a little bit again to the role of the staff, a little bit, or the role of some of the experts. So I think it's good not to be outside expert or not to be anti-expert. But how do we not reify experts, and how do we make things simple and complicated so that everyone feels like they can be just as smart as the experts we bring into the room? It's a little bit of that. Same with the bargaining model. Let's have article committees. Let's work on it. Let's workshop it. But I think with everything you have to start by doing organic leader ID. We wind up with staff-heavy models, in particular in community organizing. I just finished a big paper about this. I think I sent to Sam. I'll publish soon, which we should figure out how to get you. But I talk a lot about the weakness of the community organizing sector in America because it doesn't have a theory of organic leader identification, which good unions in the worksite do. Most unions in America don't have one either. But I wrote a book heavy on organic leader identification because if we don't identify community members or workers, depending on the structure we're in, and if it's a neighborhood precinct, like we got to make a structure so we can test and assess who the leaders are. Otherwise, we wind up with very staff-centric, staff-heavy models or apathetic models with very low participation because we're trying over and over to train people who actually may not have the right skill set to be trained for certain jobs. So it's an endemic problem. And it partly stems from sort of hyper-liberalism or this sort of horizontalism and all this sort of weird stuff, which I think we confuse with what real democracy looks like. And democratic input and voice, etc. And always starting with small things, building up to bigger things matters a ton. So that's a little bit, and it's a transition for me into the, I certainly don't mean Ken to sound like throw every bum out. I don't want to throw every bum out, and they're not all bums in terms of union leaders. I was trained and developed by the most ethical, upstanding local union leader I've ever met, by the way. And he retired out of his own good graces, right? So he was terrific. And when I first began to work with 1199 New England, there was a lot of hostility to the idea of going into the community, by the way. This whole model of like doing community charting and social networks and religious leaders, and even though I had a radical trade union leader, he was very much traditional, like worksite, worksite, worksite. Except, and going to Sarah's question, except to me it always starts with, okay, so what's not working here? I like to start with that question. What isn't working here and what is working here? If everything's working fine, I don't need to have a conversation with you, I'm leaving the room. You know, if everything here is working, happy horseshit, you got a model that's working, that's great, let's move on. Last I looked, it's mostly not working. Anything we're doing. So, as a transition point, as a place to start, it is true, I think it's very fair to say that I was definitely sort of given leadership, kind of charged, maybe kind of with it, but it's also true that I have a mentality of seizing it, right? It's a high-risk mentality of like, the ship is going down. So you're with us or not with us. And in Nevada, I started the conversation by going out and talking to thousands of workers, most of whom were not in the union, and asking people, so what's working well here? And in most shops, the answer was nothing. So that's a conversation with people. All right, so if the answer is nothing's really working very well, our grievance model is slow, it's not really working, our raise, we haven't gotten a raise in 2 contracts, we don't know who our rep is, because they're still in the Geico insurance policy model of it's something you put in your glove box and you pull out the union when you're in trouble. Nothing was really working. So we moved from a discussion about what isn't working to what might make things work better. And we do it really openly with people, and honestly. And not hold back that things that we've been doing may not be working. And it's not because someone's to blame for it, it's that it's time to stop and rethink about a model that may not be working very well. And where can we look for models where things are working well? And can we bring people in to talk about where they might be working better? And when I heard the first worker talking about that they'd gotten this letter under the door, we were in bargaining. We had won like the first thing, we were in first contract bargaining, and a worker who already began to have confidence in this thing that they were forming called a union came in and they had this piece of paper. And this is what began to happen, right? Workers have confidence in their organization. They brought this piece of paper in that they couldn't really understand because it was a letter written to make them not understand it. And it was basically the opening salvo in the privatization of their housing complex. And it was a 5-page, very legalized letter, all in English to a bunch of people who didn't speak English, notifying them of some code in section CR 45, and this is your 40-day notice to blah, blah, blah. And they had no idea what the hell it said, and they brought it to bargaining, because we had big open bargaining. And they walked in with this thing and said, can someone tell me what this is? That's the community chart right there, by the way, in 3 languages on the screen. And when they walked in, they said, we're not sure what this says, like literally, because I think she was Haitian. Spoke Creole, first language, Haitian worker. And I was like busy and didn't know, I handed it to the researcher and said, can someone go figure out what the hell this letter means, And then literally the union researcher came back and said, I think this housing complex is going to get knocked over. That was like the beginning of the end. But I knew, so when I first went to the 4 union leaders, we had 4 union leaders who were good, local union leaders. And I went to all of them and I said, I think they're going to bulldoze a bunch of this housing in town. And the reaction from good union local leaders was, not our issue. Why don't you go send that to Connecticut Citizen Action Group or go talk to some community group about it. It's not our issue. And I was like, shit. Damn it. What am I going to do now? Be an organizer, McAlevey. And I knew that I had to go back to the workers who had brought me the letter. And I pulled aside a whole group of workers and met them. There's also a meeting of a bunch of there's a backyard shot in here. We began to do these backyard meetings in the housing complexes. But I literally went to a bunch of the workers and I did a power analysis and I went to the key worker leaders in that very first nursing home we'd organized. And I said to them, I need you to ask Jerry Brown for time at the next bargaining session. Could he please stay later after the meeting? And I need you to ask him if it's okay for the union to start working on saving your house. Because what's the purpose of the union if you're not going to save your house? And so we literally, and I never told him that story until he read it in the first draft of the book. And he was like, you twit! He was like yelling at me. It was really funny, but in a laughing way. We like had a drink about it. He's like, that's why all those workers came to me and asked me to work on the housing thing. I was like, yeah, you think that just happened? Anyway, so there's a little bit of organizing too, right? It's like finding the space, creating the space, thinking through a strategy for it. I really understood because I went to the at the time it was UAW Region 9A, Phil Wheeler, it was UAW, it was 1199, it was the Hotel Restaurant Employees United Food and Commercial Workers, the first 4 unions in the multi-union campaign. And when I raised the housing issue at a meeting, I literally got slammed by all 4 union leaders. Not our issue. I was like, all right, not our issue. What a bunch of idiots. We're going to organize a bunch of workers if we actually do this, if we win this housing fight. How do I get them to think about it? And I just wanted to organize the workers to go organize the union leader. And then we moved. And then all those union leaders who once hated that housing fight in the very beginning and didn't want to work on it transitioned so quickly when they began to see that a whole new bunch of people got activated in the union in the housing fight. And then our contract bargaining meetings got bigger because people were getting turned down in the housing fight. And we were developing a whole new cadre of worker leaders for the housing fight who didn't identify with being contract stewards, who were getting super active in their leadership skills trained. And it was coming back in every way to benefit us in the first picket lines, the first strikes we did, the first, and they brought their ministers with them, and they brought their housing leaders with them, and suddenly we had public housing residents who weren't in unions marching with us on union picket lines. The whole thing just began to evolve into this whole social movement. So it's yes, in Nevada, I had some leadership, but I also had none. I had a hostile executive board. They'd hired me. but they weren't particularly excited when the first thing I said was, we're going to start to organize the private sector. They were like, no man, we're the county workers union, right? So it was the same thing. It was like figuring out space. And there, the space I quickly figured out was to start having worksite-based meetings all across the union, where we were going to ask the question, what was working and what wasn't, and what were your ideas for how to change it. And we actually sort of went around the early executive board that was sort of stuck in their old ways by taking everything to huge membership-wide votes. Because the change that the union needed made a lot of sense to most of the rank and file workers, and it may not make sense to a 10-person executive board, but it made a lot of sense to a lot of workers, and they were coming up with the ideas themselves. So we moved to a model of taking huge rank and file membership votes, which is actually how we moved to big bargaining, the first policy on going from grievances to direct action. I didn't even, just like I knew not to come back to Jerry Brown, my old leader, again, and have a fight with him as a staff person about the housing fight. I was like, don't do that again, that's not gonna work. You know, I went and talked to Marie Pierre, who had just led her nursing home fight, and got Marie Pierre, who lived in the housing complex, to knock him over, right? So in the case of where we had a difficult executive board that was very much into 5 people bargaining because they got paid to do it and they sat there all day and they got lost time pay, and why settle a contract when you don't have to go to work all day? And we took that conversation to thousands of workers outside of that small group of workers for whom the model was working really well. But if you asked most of the workers who should have been members of a union in right to work state what was working for you, things weren't working so well. So you know, it was finding ways to get to solutions around some intransigence. That's the word.
Jane, I really want to thank you for being with us tonight and for being so generous with your energy. I think this was a really dynamic conversation.